I just finished the Death of Ivan Ilyich, and I read it because a friend made a joke about the death of Ivan Ilyich, and then I looked up the book, and it turned out to be kind of a novella, not very long, and I was like, wow, this sounds interesting. I could probably read this in like a day, and then I did. So somebody made a D&D joke about, I don't know, Ivan Ilyich running out of hit points, and I was like, time for me to read this whole book. Um, and yeah, I never really know what to say about these like classics because the thing is, there just is so much to sink into. I don't know, like I find it actually a lot harder to pull out some sort of general thing to say about reading the classics because there's so much more. It's not just that there's like more to say about them, so it's hard to like, get it all into one video. It's honestly, in some cases, it's that there's less to say about them because an artistic project that partially fulfills its vision, as a lot of art does, an artistic project that has flaws and seams and stuff, there's a lot to say about that. There's a lot that you can, get into by uncovering those seams. But I really feel that the death of Ivan Ilyich, it feels like a seamless creation in some ways. Like it really feels like something that can't really be analyzed in the same way that other art can. So I don't know. Like I feel like maybe I'm just left like actually just talking about the experience I had reading this book. Um, it was kind of incredible. I mean, I really didn't get the whole Tolstoy thing before. I had to read Anna Karenina for a class that was like you read one Dostoevsky book and then one Tolstoy book, and so the price of me getting to take a class on a Dostoevsky book I wanted to talk a bunch about was that I also had to read Anna Karenina. And I don't know, Anna Karenina is okay. If you're not, I mean, unlike a lot of Dostoevsky, I feel like Tolstoy, if you're not a Christian, the book is just kind of not going to be for you. Um, I don't know. And the pitch of like Tolstoy, the idea, at least as I understand it, is that he's trying to present life in such a realistic way that his fiction just is life. Um, you know, people have called, people have said that War and Peace is like a history book. And um, I also tried to read War and Peace and I just kind of didn't get it. I just didn't, I was like, I don't like this project, you know? If I'm gonna read a book that has this much detail, like, why don't I just read about an actual guy who lived during the Napoleonic Wars? Or like a history book or something. Um, I guess I'll probably try to read War and Peace again at some point, and we'll see if my opinion changes. Because when you have that kind of reaction to to like a classic, it's usually you who's wrong and not the book that everybody loves. But anyway, I think I finally got it reading The Death of Ivan Ilyich because, first of all, I mean, Tolstoy takes that same approach. He wants to present something that just is what it is. And in this case, the thing that he wants to just present as it uh, is death, the death of this character, Ivan Ilyich. And so it's a short book. It's a novella that just goes into as much sort of psychological depth and realism as it can about this process, like what it's like to die from the first person perspective. And it's weird because when I describe it, it sounds like something so commonplace because I guess it's something that we encounter a lot in fiction. But Tolstoy takes this project more seriously than other people do, and he is more successful. And I mean, I've never died before, so I guess I can't say for sure, but I think he's more realistic as well. It occurs to me that this is one of those books, sometimes there's books where people will be like, "Oh, well, you don't know what you're talking about because you've never blah blah blah." Um, there's some sort of core experience that the author is gesturing towards that that some of us, might know more about than others. But in this book, it's like, no, the experience is being dead. If you're such an expert, you wouldn't be here. Um, anyway, yeah, it was such a lovely little book. Lovely and horrifying, of course. Um, there's a certain suspense or almost anti-suspense that is created by the title, actually, because the Tolstoy tells you right away that this book is about Ivan Ilyich dying. The first chapter takes place after he's died, and then we back up and we go through his life, and then we go through the period of his illness in a lot of detail. And the section describing his life is filled with this dread because we are aware that whatever happens to Ivan Ilyich, even though we're reading pretty mundane passages about a just a guy, just an absolute fucking dude. Um, we know that the end of this story, and it's coming very soon, is that he's going to die. Um, and so I feel like that does introduce a sort of anti-suspense to the novel. We know exactly what's going to happen, which makes these very normal passages. It invests them with something. I'm reminded um, of Hitchcock talking about, you know, two men in a film having a normal conversation, and then the camera pans down and there's a bomb under the table, and all of a sudden this normal conversation is invested with so much drama. And I feel that the entire first half of Ivan Ilyich's life, as it's described in the book, has that exact quality. I mean, Ivan Ilyich is a really normal dude. He's extremely normal. Um, I think part of Tolstoy's goal was to describe the death of a normal person. Um, and uh, yeah, he creates a very normal protagonist. I think the other thing, Ivan Ilyich is one of those characters that, I mean, in any other type of story, he would be a background character. He's an NPC. You're not supposed to focus on him, and it invests normally this kind of overlooked character with something very, he becomes the focus, and I do feel a sort of Christian love in that project, if that makes sense. Like Tolstoy really cares about this guy, not even despite, but like because he is the type of person who would typically be completely overlooked. And it's for that reason exactly that he is important to Tolstoy in his projects as a writer. Um, yeah, and I don't know, I kind of love that. Um, the other thing, like I said, I really didn't get this like uh, Russian realism like project. I didn't really understand it. Um, this sort of Tolstoyan realism. One book that I read that made me understand it a little bit better. It's actually the first book that inspired me to do this little reading blog thing. Is Rohinton Minstry's A Fine Balance. I have a video about that. And Minstry is extremely like it like wears it on his goddamn sleeve, the inspiration from Tolstoy. He wants to do the same project where he wants his story to be real. Um, you know, he okay, we'll return to my problems with realism in a second, but Minstry wants his story to be real. He wants his story to just be a real reflection of what life is really like for people. And for him, the whole rest, the narrative, as well as the for Minstry quite strong political commentary, that comes from his work stem exclusively from this idea of showing real people and having their lives be as real as possible. Um, and Minstry's book made me sort of understand this project, but I think there's something about Tolstoy himself that I didn't really get, and somehow this shorter length makes things make sense. Like War and Peace, it's a similar approach, but to the entire lives of five different families as they go through an entire era of Russian history. And that just doesn't appeal to me in the same way as like this is a book about someone dying. And that's it. That's the whole book. Um, yeah. Okay, so back to the realism thing. I think I once challenged a professor by just pushing back in the most obvious way on the definition of realism. So I had asked, he was in a theater class, and he said the idea of realism is that you um, don't know, you don't see a distinction. You see what's on stage and you perceive it as real. And my point was that that definition doesn't make any sense. That the definition is always already wrong because such a play could not take place, or at least it couldn't be very interesting. Because if we couldn't distinguish between real events and the events that occur in art, we would try to stop them, because or at least our reaction would be very different. In the context of the theater, we would try to stop them if we didn't recognize the fantasy frame that the stage provides. As soon as somebody tried to like kill someone else or something like that, the audience would, or at least some of them anyway, would jump up and try to stop it. So that definition of realism doesn't really make any sense. And I'm not just saying that to be a dick. I'm saying that to be like, so then what is realism? What actually distinguishes realist art from the art that came before it? And I didn't get a clear answer from him at the time. I still don't have a clear answer in my head. But, um, and at the time, I have to admit, I was a little bit smug about this. I'm like, oh, yeah, I'm so smart recognizing this problem, the conception, the artistic categories. Um, and I didn't have a lot of investment in the category of realism, but now I kind of do. Like having read The Death of Ivan Ilyich, I can really feel that this book is trying to do something that is completely different from other works of art. Because what the book wants is for you to know what it's like to die. And it's very direct, it's very simple. The book wants you to know what it's like to die. And that's very different than the the way that similar events would be portrayed in another genre. I mean, I could imagine the death of Ivan Ilyich, like the events of the death of Ivan Ilyich, playing a smaller role in a larger tapestry in a non-realist work of fiction, and they would come across much less horrifying. You would encounter Ivan Ilyich, you'd be like, oh yeah, this guy's kind of a loser. Why are we reading about him? Oh, good, he's dead. We're not reading about him anymore. Um, and so I feel that there is something very different happening in this book. I still can't quite put my finger on a definition of it. That provocative me from earlier was like, oh, but that definition of realism doesn't make sense. That guy still has a point, but now I'm invested in actually figuring out what definition does make sense, because it's clear that there's something very different about these works, and I want to be able to put my finger on what it is. Um, Perhaps it's not so much the realism as in like wanting the events to appear realistic as much, because that's a goal of a lot of art, and it's not like shattering or abolishing the fantasy frame that art has. That frame is very important, actually. Um, if if I were reading about the death of Ivan Ilyich, I read a lot of this book at night, and if I were reading about the death of Ivan Ilyich and I wasn't able to distinguish it from reality, I would, not be able to sleep. I would be worried sick about this guy, rather, in an enduring way, rather than being able to read about him and then go to sleep and go to work the next morning. Um, and yeah, but there's still something different. There's still something different about these books. My theory, my little pet theory that probably doesn't make any sense, is that the difference in realism is not so much the how realistic the work is, but it's in the way that the work expects you to relate to that realism, I guess. Because realistic, realism fiction um, expects you to learn something about the topic that is actually being portrayed, I suppose. I don't know, because when I apply this framework to other less exciting topics, like, the endless pages of I think his name is Lev in Anna Karenina, the secret extra protagonist. The endless pages of him like farming and stuff. Um, I don't know. Anyway, one day I will certainly come up with the definition of realism, and then oh boy, you're gonna hear about it. I'll finally settle this for good. Okay, the last thing I want to say about the death of Ivan Ilyich, is that the length is just fantastic. I mean, I think that this project of fully portraying something in a way that makes it real is much more appealing to me when it's something narrow and particular rather than like, oh, we're going to show the whole of someone's life, because that's a project that I am extremely skeptical of. I really don't I really don't think that's possible. And even if it were possible, like I don't think you would want it. Like the whole of someone's life, nobody wants that. I'm not, you know, do I even want the whole of my own life? Probably not. If I could experience my entire life in some artistic mediated form other than just living my life, that doesn't sound great to me. That doesn't sound good. Um, if it had the exact detail as my entire life, that sounds horrible actually. Like watching a movie of a normal person, and it's not even a normal person you don't know. It's yourself. That's horrible. Um, who would ever want that? Um, but when you narrow it down to when you narrow it down to something specific, and in particular something specific that everyone has anxieties about and that everybody, thinks about all the time, then I think it's then I think I understand the project. Now I get it. I get what Tolstoy was on about. He wasn't smoking crack. He was in fact onto something. Um, and not just because he inspired Rohinton Minstree. Okay, so I lied. There's actually one more thing that I want to talk about, which is the end of the end of um, the death of Ivan Ilyich, because I'm not sure how much I like it. I don't know. Like I said, I've never died before, so I'm not sure that I can really ding Tolstoy on his realism. But I feel, the book really earns something by being so brutal and being so straightforward. This guy is dying, and that doesn't draw his family together. It doesn't even make him feel especially kind towards them or them towards him. He is horrible to them, and they don't really respond in kind, because people don't do that with someone who's clearly dying. But they don't, they're not nice to him either. He has so much hatred in his heart for his wife and his children and everyone around him. Um, he says, and I can really imagine how someone on their deathbed would feel this way, that the whole situation is a charade. It's a charade, a charade to avoid, having to think about the thing that's obvious and right in front of them. And I really do. I really can't imagine when you're in such a terrible situation and people are there with you. The process of them just sort of getting on with it, just getting on with their lives. I can see how that would become offensive to you and make you angry. Um, and that's exactly what happens to Ivan Ilyich. Um, but the end, things get worse and worse. His reflections on life become more and more dire. He starts to, um, he never quite wishes that he was never born, but he says that there was a spark of light at the beginning of his life, and that it has become dimmer and dimmer for the whole of his life. That the arc of his life is of that light going out, and that's all. And that everything that he's done has been a mistake, um, which is pretty bad. I Yeah, I would say that that's pretty bad. But then the end of the end, something happens. This light sort of comes into his life. This light appears in his life. And it's not stated that, this is God, but he has a religious experience, an experience of relief. Not even relief from the pain, but relief from the suffering, I guess. Like he still experiences physical pain, but the clouds part just before he dies. And of course, this is something that happens with some people, but I just feel like it's a cop out on Tolstoy's part. He presents this really terrible situation where part of the terror is that there really is no escape. And then psych at the very last minute there is an escape, and it's here. As he says, Ivan Ilyich gets pushed into a well, pushed into a dark hole, and at the bottom of that hole he finds a speck of light, and it's just an image that I find a little bit troubling, because on the one hand, I know that some people do really experience it that way, like people who've had near death experiences, and from talking to people who are like in the process of dying, we do know, and like just observing them, we do know that the clouds do part for some people, that you have this horrible death experience, and then right at the end things seem to get all the way better before the person passes away. This happens sometimes with people who have Alzheimer's, other conditions as well. Um, but it doesn't happen with everyone. I'm not even certain that it's an especially common experience. It's just something that does happen. And so I really feel in some way that Tolstoy flinches away from what he's trying to do at the last minute. He can't, he cannot, can't really show us a man who's, in agony, someone who's been trying not to think about their death for their whole life, someone who feels that their life is ruined and now was a waste, that their life was a one big mistake, and now it's over and it's too late to fix that mistake, and then fucking the end. Like he can't do that, so or he's scared to do that, or maybe his religion prevents him from being able to do that. And so instead, at the last minute, he gives us this glimmer of hope, and I'm not sure that's real. I don't know what to say. Yeah. Well, anyway, those are those are my thoughts on the death of Ivan Ilyich. I guess I did have a lot to say about this book after all. Ta-da. Um, yeah. If you feel like, being deeply preoccupied with the question of death, which I can't recommend highly enough, go out there and get The Death of Ivan Ilyich. I rate it 5 cancerous pancreases out of 5.